From the grottos of hell to the dark skies above, resounding through the night, the Death Ship Symphony.
This is going to be a bit different from my usual episode-by-episode show. I'm not going to give you a beat-by-beat summation of the plot peppered with jokes. Instead, I'm going to assume you've seen the show, or read the book, or know a bit about the Franklin expedition. I'm going to go through the episode, pick out stuff and talk about what's real history, what's from the book, what's conjecture, and what definitely didn't happen. It's basically me talking about history and using the episodes as a guide to what I should discuss. So, expect spoilers. And speaking of spoilers, the intro spoils stuff. Franklin, Crozier and Fitzjames disintegrate like the Tumbak had the Infinity Gauntlet, but while Fitzjames and Franklin become skulls, signifying them dying, Crozier becomes this weird swirly face, the symbol of the shaman controlling the Tumbak, who was killed by the crew and seen by David Young as he dies. This signifies Crozier surviving and becoming a shaman in control of the Tumbak, which cleverly only happens in the book. The mask is a basically accurate reproduction of actual Inuit ceremonial masks. Anyway, episode 1, Go for Broke. The first scene is a Scottish guy, who I assume is Dr. John Ray, the first Franklin searcher with Sir James Clark Ross, Crozier's best friend. They're asking the Inuit about what happened to the cruise.
Ask him if one of these men is the one he's calling a Gluka.
This didn't happen. Ray talked to the Inuit and discovered the crew's fate, but he was alone. Ross also searched, though by sea, and found nothing. Crozier is referred to as Aglika by the Inuit, and it's not 100% clear, but Ross doesn't seem to know that Aglika was Crozier's Inuit nickname from long before the expedition sailed, which seems a bit unlikely. You see, Crozier picked up the name almost 20 years earlier when he made friends with some members of a tribe when helping out with medical stuff. His closest Inuit friend was a man named Aglika, and he and Crozier swapped names when dealing with the other's people. To the Inuit, Crozier was Aglika. To the British, Crozier's friend was Crozier. But since the local Inuit also had a habit of calling white travellers Aglika because it meant Longstrider, he could have just been being cautious and making sure it was Crozier. These pictures are recreations of the daguerreotypes taken before the expedition sailed. Most of the originals have been lost, but we have copies. And they really were that small. The stuff in the story about the surviving men being pursued by the Tumbak is completely invented.
There was Tumbak behind them.
Tumbak?
The thing made of muscles and spells.
The Tumbak doesn't exist. It was created for the book, though very broadly based on an actual spirit and Inuit myth. I do have an issue with this scene. Why is the Inuit name-dropping the Tumbak, a word they're not familiar with, and telling them that it followed the survivors? That sort of thing doesn't dissuade further searchers, it encourages them. Honestly, this would have worked better.
Everybody's dead, Dave.
What, Todd Hunter?
Everybody's dead, Dave.
What, Selby?
They're all dead. Everybody's dead, Dave.
Are you trying to tell me everybody's dead?
A few years earlier, Crozier is visibly irritated by being visited by Franklin and Fitzjames on terror. This is pretty much true to character. From his letters, it's pretty clear that while he started out really liking Sir John Franklin, that affection was mainly gone by the time they left Greenland. The show has its own reasons for this, but in reality, according to Crozier himself, it was because Franklin ran a very lax ship, and when doing polar exploration, that was dangerous. As for Fitzjames, Crozier has few kind words for him. It seems to have been a series of small irritations rather than anything huge. At one point in London, a supply of tea was sent to Fitzjames in Erebus. He wouldn't have minded so much, but the bill was sent to the right place. There's a bit of a huge historical inaccuracy when Fitzjames is referred to as a captain when they board the Terror.
Captain Fitzjames.
He was a commander, though doubtless he received some kind of field promotion when Franklin died. Fitzjames' story about the battle in China is basically accurate. He took a musket ball through the arm in the First Opium War and then wrote a 10,000-word comedy poem about it. That's not a joke. And that's far from his only exploit. Fitzjames built his career on throwing himself headlong into danger to prove himself. Why? That comes up in a later episode. Character-wise, Franklin, Crozier and Fitzjames are all pretty accurate to the history when it comes to the good and the bad. Franklin was devout, had confidence well beyond his competence, and was very pleasant. Crozier knew his stuff but was depressive, felt put upon and was isolated. Fitzjames was inexperienced and thought little of danger. The most inaccurate part, bizarrely, is their haircuts. Franklin was bald, Crozier's hair had gone grey a few years before the expedition sailed, and Fitzjames's hair was curly. They spent so much money on accurate recreations of the ships, and they are accurate. They even got Matthew Betts, a model maker and an expert in HMS Terror, whose work is in museums to work on them. But they didn't do the same thing for the hair. It's just weird. They could have saved Tobias Menzies from having to wear that wig. One last note on the meal. The real Crozier hated that he was expected to socialise with the officers on a regular basis. He had a team that he knew and liked in Antarctica, but on this expedition he had no friends among the officers. His mood likely wasn't helped that he had to pay for any officer's dues on Terror by buying his own expensive silverware. Enough for a full complement. One of Erebus's cabin boys, David Young, dies of tuberculosis. This killed the 3 crewmen buried at Beechy Island. So it's far from unlikely that others might have died from it in the months and years that followed. It's odd that he seems to be serving on Terror, though. He and his mate see Fitzjames come aboard for the meal with Crozier. Young didn't mention his symptoms earlier out of fear of disappointing Sir John Franklin. He dies after begging Dr. Goodster not to tell Sir John that he was afraid. Obviously, this is conjecture, but it's showing something real. That Franklin was a very popular and inspiring captain with his men.
I didn't want to disappoint Sir John.
Well, he can praise your loyalty as he buries you.
As Young dies, he has a hallucination of an Inuit, the shaman that controls the Tumbak. His face a twisted mask, the same shape as Crozier's face in the intro. In the book, the shamans were psychic and that's how they controlled the Tumbak. He's trying to warn the crew to leave the area so the Tumbak can't kill them. Controlled is probably the wrong word. They keep the Tumbak from eating the Inuit. The Tumbak stays isolated, the shamans keep it sort of under control, and any Inuit bands in the area keep away and don't end up dead. That's the deal. But the ships have sailed right into the Tumbak's jail. Young is autopsied and the incision, instead of a Y shape, is a straight line down. Not much is known about early Victorian autopsy techniques, and in the 80s, when the Beech Island bodies were dug up, it was discovered that John Hartnell had been autopsied, and there was a Y incision, but it was upside down. We don't know if that was normal procedure then, or a one-off. One of the crewmen is thrown overboard and soon dies when the Erebus hits some ice. It gets lodged in the propeller. Both Erebus and Terror had propellers run by literal steam trains in the bowels of the ships. Henry Collins, second mate in the Erebus, has to get into a dive suit to remove the ice, and this part is a very big question mark. Diving suits did exist in 1845, the first was invented in 1710, but I see no information about whether the expedition brought any. The risk of ice jamming the propeller was very real, so they logically should have had one, but the water was likely so cold that anyone who went under for any length of time would probably die, so maybe they didn't bother. We have a flashback to a series of theatrical dioramas before the expedition sailed. Among them is one showing Crozier and Sir James Clark Ross at then furthest south. They had taken the Erebus and Terror to map as much of Antarctica as they could. That's why the most famous landmarks in Antarctica include Mount Erebus, the Ross Ice Shelf, and Cape Crozier. They were the only wooden ships ever to make it through the Antarctic pack ice. They managed it 6 times in 4 years. The next people to even try were metal-hulled ships, and the furthest south would stand for almost 60 years. At the time of the Franklin expedition's launch, the Ross Antarctic expedition was a massive deal. It got Ross a knighthood, offer of command of the Franklin expedition, the biggest deal in exploration at the time, and helped Victorian society realise that he was the pimpingest human being who ever lived. It got Crozier a promotion.
If you believe that depiction, you've dropped a stone at least since we've been back.
You've seen a dentist as well, apparently.
I have no idea if this actually happened, but what it's representing certainly did. Victorian art definitely used to represent the Irish as ugly brutes, while accentuating the handsomeness of the English. The reason Ross didn't command the Franklin expedition is that he'd recently married, and he's promised his wife that he'd retire from exploration. The most definite historical inaccuracy here is that Sir James Clark Ross is too young. He was in his mid-40s at this point, only a few years younger than Crozier. Crozier is courting Sophia Cracroft, Franklin's niece at this point, but I'll talk about her in another episode. When Franklin has a meeting with all the officers to discuss what to do about the increasing amount of ice around them, everything they discuss is obviously conjecture. Hell, every conversation in the show is conjecture, or flat out didn't happen. But they bring up a lot of stuff that was very real. Them not knowing that King William Island was an island, because the eastern side hadn't been mapped yet. That Sir John Franklin's previous Arctic experience didn't exactly prepare him for the expedition. It was mainly overland, and he almost starved. Did Franklin demand that they go around the north side of King William Island and get them trapped in the ice? Did Crozier suggest checking to see if they could sail down the east side? It's impossible to tell, and remember that this has been written with much more information than any of the real men had. As overall commander, Franklin had the final say, but it's possible that Crozier suggested going around the north side. We don't know. It's also possible that Franklin wanted to go that way and Crozier kept any issues he might have had to himself. It wouldn't be the first time. When they were sailing to Greenland on the expedition, Terror was tailing Erebus, and Crozier realised that Erebus had made a wrong turn. He deliberately didn't signal them about their mistake because rather childishly he wanted to see how long it would take Franklin to realise what he'd done. Apparently they lost about half a day's travel. So the outspoken Captain Crozier of the show, who won't suffer Franklin's foolishness gladly, may well be an invention. But then again, previously they had nothing to lose but half a day in Greenland. Now they may lose their lives. Based on all my reading, I'm guessing that something like this scene happened. That Crozier likely warned about pack ice. He had first-hand experience with it in Antarctica and took it very seriously. How seriously? He stood at the wheel for 20-odd hours a day when dealing with the Antarctic pack ice, without gloves because they impinged his control on the wheel. He would sleep for a few hours a night, fully dressed in his chair by the door so he could be back on deck in seconds if need be. His experience in Antarctica turned his hair grey and left his hands with a severe tremor. It occurs to me that I've not actually explained what pack ice is. Floating sea ice. In the warmer months, a collection of icebergs. In the colder months, they freeze together into massive bergs, or islands of ice. A ship caught in it in winter can only hope that it's not crushed or doesn't drift hundreds of miles off course. The pack he navigated in Antarctica was miles upon miles of icebergs. A maze of icebergs that could easily have crushed both ships. He had a number of near misses with the pack, including a time when Erebus and Terror were frozen into an iceberg. But I'm going to go into detail about that in a later video. Crozier angrily points out to Fitzjames that only 4 of the officers at the table are Arctic veterans. This is true, almost no one involved in the expedition had Arctic experience. Fitzjames was in charge of choosing the crew, and he mainly chose men he'd served with in China and the Middle East. The job of choosing the crew usually fell to the second-in-command, Crozier. But he was overlooked as Fitzjames was Barrow, the expedition's godfather's favourite. Crozier chose one man, Jobson, his loyal valet on Terror. I've not been able to confirm this, but I believe he served under Crozier in Antarctica. It's easy and probably right to point to the choice of crew as one of the many factors that led to disaster, but polar experience was something that most people didn't want to do a second time. If Crozier had been in charge, I don't know how many willing veterans he could have found. Towards the end of the episode, they stopped to bury David Young, and I have to say that if they're in a rush, which in the show they are, I think they'd have opted for burial at sea rather than taking the time to carve a grave at a solid rock. Franklin was a religious man, but burial at sea was no less Christian than burial on land, especially for someone who'd spent a lifetime in the Navy. Now, this grave isn't based on anything that's been found in real life, but look how he's dressed. His clothes, the handkerchief around his head. That's attention to detail. He looks identical to John Torrington, the first of the Beach Island bodies. Some little historical notes at the end of the episode. Trapped in the ice, the crews use charges of black powder to try and break their way to open water, as dynamite has yet to be invented. And we see Franklin as a painting of the actual Lady Jane Franklin by his bed. The episode ends with Erebus and Terror stuck about 11 miles from King William Island, and Crozier giving Franklin the mother of all acid stares for ignoring his advice.